In the 90s, one company built its entire identity on destroying Nintendo. Their slogan was, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. For a moment, you're actually winning. But fast forward to today, Sega doesn't make consoles anymore. They make Sonic games for Nintendo. The hunter became the employee, and the story of how that happened is not what you think.
Eggman's forces are surging into the city. We need you here now.
To really get how far Sega fell, have to see just how they climbed. Back in the late 80s, the video game industry wasn't a competition, it was a Nintendo monopoly. After the video game crash of 1993, Nintendo single-handedly revived the whole market with the NES. It had an iron grip on about 90% of the industry. Mario was king, and everyone knew that. Sega was mostly an arcade company back then. They tried to break into the home market with the Master System, but it barely made a scratch on the NES. For the next shot, they knew they couldn't just release another console. They had to start a war. In 1999, they dropped the Sega Genesis in North America. It was a 16-bit powerhouse, a whole generation ahead of the 8-bit NES. And Sega of America crafted a marketing plan that was nothing short of brilliant. They didn't just sell a console, they sold an attitude. The slogan was simple and it was savage. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. It was a direct shot, positioning Sega as the cooler, edgier alternative. While Nintendo was for kids, the Genesis was for teens. It had sports games with real athletes. It had edgy arcade-style games, and plenty of other cool genres. And then, in 1991, they unleashed their ultimate weapon, Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic was everything Mario wasn't. He was fast, he was impatient, and he had thud. He was the perfect mascot for a company trying to tear down the establishment. And it worked. The Genesis, bundled with Sonic, flew off the shelves. For a few holiday seasons in a row, Sega was outselling Nintendo. But what about Nintendo's response? They didn't panic. They released Super Mario World, Zelda: Link to the Past, and Super Metroid, games that didn't just sell consoles, they created lifelong fans. Sonic was more like Flash, Mario was Foundation, and the difference would matter when the hardware worlds got ugly. With the Genesis a massive success, what could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, everything. Sega's victory, as awesome as it was, didn't last long. The company's fall wasn't because of one thing, but a whole lot of terrible decisions that scared away fans, stores, and developers. The first big mistake came in the form of add-ons. Instead of working on a true successor to the Genesis, Sega decided to get weird and split its own audience. First came the Sega CD in 1992, then the 32Fs in 1994. These were expensive upgrades for the Genesis that promised the consoles were right around the corner. Sega was literally competing with itself and losing. Meanwhile, Nintendo kept it simple. One console, one message. The Super Nintendo just kept selling. No add-ons, no confusion. While Sega was fracturing their own fanbase, Nintendo was consolidating theirs. This mess set the stage for one of the most infamous moments in gaming history, the launch of the Sega Saturn. Everyone knew that Saturn was coming. Sega of America had a massive marketing blitz planned for Saturn Day, September 2nd, 1995. But at E3, in May of that year, Sega of America's CEO walked onto the stage and basically dropped a bomb. The Saturn was available. Not in September, right now. He announced that 30,000 units were already at certain stores. This surprise launch was meant to be a knockout blow against their new rival, Sony, and its upcoming PlayStation. Instead, it only ended up hurting them. Retailers like KB Toys were left out, were furious, and refused to ever stock the Saturn. Developers were completely blindsided. So, the Saturn launched with almost no third-party games. And then there was the price, $400. A few hours later, Sony took the stage. The head of Sony Computer Entertainment America walked up to the podium, said a single number, $300, and walked off to thunderous applause. In one word, Sony destroyed Sega's entire strategy. But here's what people forget. Nintendo was waiting and deciding what to do. A year later, they dropped the N64 at just €200 with Super Mario 64. The N64 didn't beat the PlayStation, but it didn't need to. Nintendo stayed profitable while Sega bled money fighting Sony. Sega was now in a two-front war and losing vote. Sega had one last chance, one final shot to get back to the top. That shot was the Dreamcast. Launched in 1999, the Dreamcast was an incredible piece of hardware. It was the first console with a built-in modem for online gaming. The graphics were beautiful, and it had a library of legendary games like Sonic Adventure and Crazy Taxi. The launch was a huge success, but the ghost of the past was hanging over them. Gamers who got burned by the 32X and Saturn were hesitant to trust Sega again. Key third-party developers, most famously EA, refused to support the system. And then there was the looming shadow of the PS2. The PS2 hype machine was in overdrive, promising a console that could play games and play DVDs, just the hot new thing. A lot of people just decided to wait. And Nintendo, they were preparing the GameCube. It wasn't flashy, but it had what Nintendo always had: Mario, Zelda, and Smash Bros. While Sega threw everything at Dreamcast, hoping to survive, Nintendo knew they didn't need to win the hardware race. They just needed their games. The numbers just weren't enough. Sega was still losing millions on every console they sold. And unlike a giant like Sony, they didn't have the deep pockets to absorb those kinds of losses. The company was in serious trouble. On January 31st, 2001, Sega made the announcement that shocked the entire industry. They're discontinuing the Dreamcast. After years in the hardware business, Sega was officially out of the console market. The console war was over. Nintendo had won, and Sega, the challenger, was defeated. To survive, Sega had to completely reinvent itself. But they still had one massive asset: their games. Their iconic character and the amazing development team were their lifeline. So they started down a new path, one that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. Sega became a third-party developer. And in a twist no one saw coming, one of the first consoles they started developing for was Nintendo's. Soon, Sonic the Hedgehog, the character literally created to take down Nintendo, was appearing on the Nintendo GameCube. Here's the kicker. While Sega was collapsing, Nintendo posted a profit. The GameCube sold over 21 million units. Not huge, but enough to keep them alive. And they had the Game Boy Advance, printing money on the side. Nintendo didn't need to dominate, they just needed to survive. And they did. So how did Nintendo win the console wars? Not by being the biggest. Sony beat them there. Not by being the coolest. Sega had that. Nintendo won by being patient, profitable, and focused. While Sega chased market shares with the Genesis, 32X, CD, Saturn, and Dreamcast, 5 platforms in 8 years, Nintendo released 2, the NES and N64. That's it. They didn't overextend. They didn't panic. While Sega burned money fighting Sony head-to-head, Nintendo found a different lane: handhelds, first-party franchises, profitability over market dominance. Now, some of you might say, but Sony killed Sega, not Nintendo. And you're right, Sony delivered the final blow. But Nintendo set the stage. Sega tried to outcool Nintendo, then outtech Sony. They lost both fights. Nintendo stayed in their lane, focused on games, and survived. And when Sega finally collapsed, Nintendo was still standing. Not because they crushed Sega, but because they outlasted them. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories about gaming history. And I have to ask, what's your favorite Sega memory? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, I was David, and bye. Have a nice day.